Hello everybody, it's NinjaValue here, answering your LEGO Universe questions again. If you have a question at any point, throw it in the comments. If I think there's enough content to be discussed for a video, I'll make one on it. Otherwise, I'll answer it just in the comment section, and it really helps me out because without your questions, I can't really do this series. With that said, today's question comes from 2K Law. I spent a lot of this time on the channel discussing adding completely new worlds to the game using client modding, and don't really spend much time discussing the simplest and most practical way of adding something to the game. Just find something that's already there. For whatever reason, when the game client on our computers was being released back in the day, the developers left a lot of extra stuff in it, something which they capitalised on during the Mythron handout in the final days of the game. In other words, by far the simplest option available to any project which wants to implement new content is just to take this content and give it a place in the game. Take for example one of the things that got me to play LEGO Universe to begin with. The Maelstrom enemies advertised to be coming soon to Ninjago. The Bone Wolf, Vulture, Beetle and Underhand. Out of these, only the Bone Wolf was actually included in the game in its live release. But we also know a lot of test stuff is in the client, so how about we take a look for these? Like those in most games, every object in LU is assigned a unique ID, so that even if it shares, say, a name with another object, the two can still be distinguished by that ID. Well, this ID is what the server sees when we talk about different objects, so how can we find the ID for an object? Well, fortunately a database called cdclient.fdb exists in the client to do exactly this, to tell the client which object has which features. Within this database it's an objects table, and if I want to find the Underhand, say, I can just go into this table and look it up. Now, this table itself isn't in the easiest format to read, but fortunately there have been lots of people, far cleverer than myself, throughout the years who have extracted this, and so you can very easily find either an extractor in LCDR's utils or just ask someone nicely for an SQLite version of the file, which you can view using SQLite browser. Unfortunately, however, after just typing VU into the name section of the object database, there are already no results. It looks as though there's no Bone Vulture object in the game, right? Well, as it turns out, this is wrong, because for some reason, the developers decided to remove a lot of objects from the objects table. Everything you were meant to see in the game is there, but there's some stuff that's still hidden. And honestly, I find this slightly odd. As players, we weren't meant to be able to see the game database to begin with, but even if we could, it's not like we could do anything with it. We didn't have the ability to spawn items in. And if we'd unpacked the client enough to see the database, as well as unpacking the database into a readable format, then we'd be able to see all the content files anyway. In fact, if we check the correct place, we can find the mesh object for the Bone Vulture. It's in a really intuitive place. It's not very hidden. So we know it must be there somewhere in the client. All in all, it just seems a very strange way of hiding stuff from us, given the fact that anyone who's looked this far would inevitably realise that objects were left out and would know how to find them. But how do we find them then? Well, this requires a touch of understanding as to how LEGO Universe objects are built up. Turns out, all objects in LEGO Universe are made from various components put together. For instance, the Bone Vulture alone has 6 different components, honestly not all of which I recognise, and one more component than most other enemies in the game, given the ID 5, which according to the docs refers to a script component. Anyway, in order to link up all of these components to the correct object, there's a table called the component registry, which gives all of the components things such as the script component, but also things like the render component, which is how you see something in the game, the physics component, which is how you hit it, and the destructible component, which is how you can attack it, and links all of these to the correct object ID. To find a missing object, all we need to do is take a guess at part of one of the components. In this case, I'm going to guess that the word vulture is somewhere in the mesh file path of the render component, which it is. From there, I get the render component ID, I can plug that back into the components registry, along with the fact that the render component ID is component 2, and I get an object ID for it. Even though that object ID appears nowhere in the object ID table, this is enough to still give the game and to still spawn a Bone Vulture or an Underhand or a Bone Beetle in. This has been a bit of a delve into the internal workings of the game database, but I hope it goes to explain a little about looking for objects. But how many of these objects are there? Well, for an idea of scale, let's look at how many enemies there were. At a rough estimate, I'd say there are probably on the order of 50 enemies in the game, maybe up to 100 depending on how many different variants appear in things like Survival and the Battle at Nimbus Station, because for instance, the sentries spawned in Vanguard Survival have 4 health rather than the 3 most sentries have, and so you basically find they're a totally separate enemy in the game database. Somewhere around 100 anyway. Well, in the objects database, there are 272 objects listed as enemies, from things such as the unimplemented Maelstrom Bunny to a wandering bee from the old Wonderland world. Not all of them are entirely complete, but a lot of the time, a large part of the enemy is there, certainly enough to make adding them to the game possible and far less difficult than adding and animating a completely new enemy. And those are just the listed objects. This isn't even including the hidden objects like the Bone Vulture. In fact, there are entire worlds which are already partially included in the game, such as Ninjago's Earth Gauntlet, which requires a minimal amount of client modding to run. And what was the Earth Gauntlet? Well, it was the equivalent of the better known Fire Temple, whose release was advertised before LEGO Universe closed, but unlike the Fire Temple, had map and level files included in the client. With this all out of the way, now on to 2K Lore's actual question. There was an advertised Garmadon boss battle in LEGO Universe towards its close. Is there any leftover files for this so that it could be implemented? Unfortunate reality is that although there are lots of assets listed in the client for this area, which was to be the Fire Temple, they're all included under the mesh/Fire Temple file path, or at least all of the meshes are, which unfortunately doesn't exist in the client, meaning that, well, we don't have it. So the Fire Temple would have to be reconstructed, unless a developer came forward offering a client which contained those files. Also, doing a similar check, I found no references to Garmadon outside of his cutscene as you approach him in the Ninjago Monastery, and one asset in the non-existent Fire Temple file path for a statue of him. There is no information anywhere on the game about him as an enemy, as far as I know. So, I hope that answers your question. The Fire Temple and the Garmadon boss battle within will probably never see as it was implemented, if it ever even was. But the Earth Gauntlet is far more promising. Neil Spellman has a video on his channel where he loads in the map, and this was using reasonably old tech. If we need enemies to fill this map with, well, we know we can find various unreleased bone enemies which are literally just waiting to be added and were probably planned to be added into these worlds. I just took a look at the asset list for the Earth Gauntlet, and pretty much everything needed for it we have in the client. Anyway, I hope that answers your question and explains a little more about how much stuff we actually have literally just lying around in a messy client which we can implement. It's just unfortunate we don't have any of the assets for Fire Temple or Garmadon, I'm afraid, even if we can see exactly where they would have been in all developer clients. And with that, as always, if I'm going to keep doing this series, I need your questions, so throw them in the comments section. Also, as always, developer channels are in the description. Subscribe to them and show them your support. It really means a lot to them to know that people care, and it keeps the projects going. That said, I've been Ninja. Thank you for listening, and I will see you around.